Hello there, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome to episode one of Experimenting with Existence, where we'll take a look at strategy board games and everything related to them. So, as I mentioned in episode zero, where I introduced the series, uh, basically what I'm going to be up to in each of these episodes in the series is taking a close, in-depth look at the areas of life outside of philosophy, for the most part, that interest me the most, right? What I'm most passionate about. And so this episode is going to be no exception to that, right? You're going to basically I'm going to offer a deep dive into everything strategy board games related. So just to offer you briefly an overview of all the parts that will comprise this episode, I'll start off with part one. I thought it would be best to just begin by establishing what I even mean by a strategy board game. Some of us might not be familiar with the idea of a strategy board game. Granted, they have become a little more popular here in America than when I was first introduced to them way back in 2008. There's still probably, a handful of us who don't actually know what is really meant by a strategy board game. So part one, again, I'll get into what exactly strategy board games are, and not only that, but some important, I would say, at least if you become immersed in the hobby, some lingo or distinctions and concepts that are pretty common that you'll come across if you become a gamer, right? If you become immersed in the hobby of strategy board games. So that'll be part one. Part two, I alluded to like my beginning, and my history then. So I'll get into my beginning and history personally with strategy board games. So that started back in 2008. I'll go into, what it was that sort of sparked my introduction to the wonderful world of strategy board games. So I'll get into that, and I'll talk about what my history with strategy board games has been like ever since. So again, in all sorts of aspects, playing online and so on. And part three, I'll get into what I think is valuable about strategy board games, right? Not only playing, but at least in my case and in some people's cases, designing them as well. So what do I think? Not only what have I, and I'll talk to this or speak to this, what I personally garner from playing and designing strategy board games. Well, what do I think people in general get out of, or at least could if they were made aware of these games? What can they get out of strategy board games? So again, that's part three. Part four, we'll actually take a look at my collection. So I've amassed quite a collection over the years. It's been about, what is it, a decade and a half now. So I'll go ahead and sort of show you what my collection looks like. I'll go into maybe some of my favorite designers. So I've become pretty familiar with some of the more popular, a lot of the board game designers that are published, and particularly the more popular ones. And I have, over the years, have come to establish my own personal favorites, right? When they put out a game, I'm very eager to play it. So I'll go through some of my favorite designers, some of my favorite games. That'll be part four. Part five, I mentioned that I design games myself. I'll actually get into then what that's like. At what point did I start designing games? Pretty much right when I started playing them, but I'll get into that more, what the design process is, what that looks like for me at least. And what it's been like meeting other like-minded people. I'll get into, actually, that's then part six, when I'll get into entering a design contest then and meeting like-minded people. So going back to part five, though, I'll get into, again, the design process for me, some of my favorite designs, go into, with respect to some of those favorite designs, I'll show you some of the boards, probably give you a glimpse of a lot of the boards, if not all of the boards, but then give you an in-depth sort of look at some of my favorites of my designs. And then, like I said, then it's been nice over the years sort of coming to meet like-minded people, especially those who are designers themselves, because there's not a whole lot of people that play these strategy games to begin with, and then there's far fewer who then actually design them. And so meeting other like-minded people, especially when they're doing so, is so infrequent. That is always an enriching experience and rewarding oftentimes. So I'll get into one of those experiences when I entered one of my designs very early on when I started playing and designing games back in 2010. What my experience was entering the 2010 Rio Grande Games design contest, where a buddy and I drove up to Milwaukee to enter this contest. to enter my game into this contest. And then part 7, I'll get into then my interaction with a publisher. It was pretty brief, but it was interesting sort of what that process is like. And that sort of piggybacks off of the previous part, because the winner of that Rio Grande design contest, actually their game was going to be published, or it is published by Rio Grande Games. And so if I could win that contest, right, I was guaranteed then to have my game published. So again, part 6, I had a publisher show some interest in some of my designs, so I'll get into kind of what that experience was like. That was part 7. And then part 8, I'll go into the final part. I'll go into UMKC, University of Missouri at Kansas City. They have an entrepreneurship scholars program, which I entered and completed back in 2013. And so I will dive into, what that whole process was like. And so that was completely different for me. It's one thing to design games. It's a whole nother thing to, which this program was geared towards. It's a whole nother thing to try to market and sell, your designs, right? Totally different process. And so I'll get into the dynamics of that and what that experience was like for me. Among other things, just to foreshadow, it was a very worthwhile experience. I learned a lot. I fleshed out a lot in terms of game design and so on. But one thing I definitely learned is that I'm not a salesman. The business world I'm not cut out for the business world. I am a creative design sort of person, not pitching. I don't do well, at least I don't enjoy pitching things, selling things, trying to market those ideas that I've designed and so on. So I'll elaborate more on that again in part 8. So let's go ahead, though, without further ado, and dive into part 1 then. So before we go any further, we ought to, right? We're discussing strategy board games. It probably behooves us to establish what exactly a strategy board game is. Right? We're doing a whole episode on strategy board games after all. So, by the way, strategy board games, aka also known as Euro games. So if I use that expression, one of the things I'm going to do in this particular part is try to articulate what certain terms and concepts mean. But if I say Euro games, I mean the same thing, strategy board games. Okay, they're synonymous. So we'll go ahead and get into, articulate, well, what exactly is a Euro game or a strategy board game? The first thing I mentioned right off the bat is, just like the name strategy implies, these are games that involve thinking, planning ahead, right? So it's not only strategy, right? So they're referred to as strategy board games, but another term, and we'll kind of work out the nuanced differences between these two terms, but another term you hear a lot is tactics. These games are tactical too. And so both, right, strategy and tactics reflect that these games involve thinking. And that's really the thing that I guess here at the outset I would want to emphasize, right, is that what stands out about strategy board games is that they involve thinking, planning, right? You have to exercise the mind, so to speak. So hence, at least this was true for me, another thing I'd point out is they're not usually the games we grew up playing. At least if you were like me, growing up in America back in the day, you were playing games like Candyland or Life or Monopoly, these sorts of games. And that is by all means not what we mean to pick out when we refer to strategy board games. It's not those sorts of games, which, if you think about it, you don't really play those games. You're not really making choices or deciding things. A lot of times the game's playing you, right? You're drawing a card and you're doing whatever the card tells you, or you're spinning a spinner and you're moving that number of spaces, and that's it, right? And that's what I mean by it, in the sense that the game's playing you. That's like almost the opposite, okay, of what at least I have in mind when I think of a strategy board game, right? Strategy board game, it's the opposite of having no control whatsoever, or thinking not at all, like you do when you spin a spinner, or just draw a card and then do whatever it says, right? You're actually, there's involved, right? This thought process, this thinking element is involved. Okay, now whether that be, again, we'll get into strategy versus tactics here in a moment, whether that be sort of long-term planning, i.e. strategy, or short-term adjustments to whatever the current game status is, i.e. tactics. there is a lot of thought involved, okay? Thinking involved. And so that's the major, I guess, number one thing I would emphasize when it comes to strategy board games. And I would begin again by, when you're trying to carve out or flesh out what we mean by strategy board games, it helps to juxtapose them with, at least if you're like me, the games you grew up playing, right, which are entirely dictated by chance, usually, right, and the game is playing you. That's not the case with these strategy board games. Closely related kind of distinction to this point I've been making is in the gaming world. So if you become a gamer, right, you become immersed in this hobby. One of the distinctions you oftentimes hear about is like Ameri-trash versus Euro games. Okay, and so I wouldn't say like Candyland even constitutes, right? Those games I mentioned earlier. If they're going to qualify as one or the other, Ameri-trash. Okay, so I guess I could write that up here real quick. It's just a hobby name, right? I guess it'd be like a dysphonism. A hobby name for a certain type of game, right? And those are oftentimes contrasted with Euro games or strategy games. Okay, but I don't. So in some sense, right, piggybacking on the last point I was making, the games we grew up in some sense grew up with are in some sense of the Ameri-trash ilk. The idea in general with Ameri-trash is that you're rolling lots of dice, lots of interaction and battling, and the strategic elements, the thinking elements, they're usually a little bit lighter on that. Now that's not to say that gamers don't enjoy Ameri-trash, right? And that's why I hesitated to necessarily associate games like Candyland, Chutes and Ladders, and so on with Ameri-trash, because no gamer likes Candyland, Chutes and Ladders, so on, where there's literally no decision points at all. There's no decision making. But some gamers do like Ameri-trash, right? And I guess, again, the reason why I'm going to this distinction now is because if you were going to associate those games that a lot of us Americans grew up playing, right, those luck-driven games where they're playing you, if you're going to associate them with one or the other, I would say it would be Ameri-trash. But again, I hesitate to do so. And I wanted to flesh out what exactly, if you come across those labels, Ameri-trash and Euro games or strategy games, what exactly those labels are meant to depict. Again, Ameri-trash are games where there's lots of die rolling, lots of battling and interaction amongst the players, and there's a lot more luck involved typically. Whereas, again, with Euro games or strategy board games, the luck involved is minimized, and there's a lot more strategy and tactics. Certainly much more strategy involved, long-term planning. Okay. So I wanted to talk again about some important concepts that you will come across, and I started doing that here with Ameri-trash versus Euro games. But I wanted to continue to do that, and as we proceed here, I'm actually going to. I mentioned the UMK in the introduction. I mentioned that I participated in the UMKC's Entrepreneurship Scholars Program, and as part of that program, I had to do all sorts of businessy assignments, including ultimately completing a business plan, a full-out business plan. And so, in the process of doing all this, I broke down a lot of stuff that is then relevant for this episode. So I'm actually working with a lot of stuff that I used back in that program. So, including then, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of mechanics. So another board game term that as you become more immersed in the hobby, you'll come across more and more. And all we mean by mechanics, as I mentioned in, what was this called? Gap analysis? I forgot what all these business assignments were, but one of the assignments I had to do the sort of this breakdown and consisted of a PowerPoint. And so I got into some of the key concepts involved in strategy board games. And again, I'll say a lot more about that program and what I was up to in the last part of the episode. But I do reference, again, the idea of mechanics when in one of those PowerPoint presentations. So as I say there, right, it refers to the main elements involved in the general gameplay. And so I get into, I'm not going to go through all the ones listed, on that PowerPoint slide, but I go into several of them that I discussed in that particular presentation. So again, in general, it's just sort of an element of the gameplay a major element of the gameplay. And so all the board games then, when you describe them or hear them described, oftentimes you'll hear what mechanics are, or what are the main mechanics in the gameplay. So it might be, for example, I think I have card drafting is one of them, right? The idea is everybody that's playing has the same pool of cards that they then usually one at a time, right, take turns selecting from. I'll go through a card drafting game, go through it in more detail, one called Seven Wonders in a later part of the episode, where it involves that sort of card drafting mechanism, where actually in that game you have a hand of cards. Each player starts off with a hand of cards, draws one, passes them to the next player, and then with their new set draws another one, right? That's using the mechanic of card drafting. That's one form of that mechanic. Worker placement, that's one towards the top of that PowerPoint slide. That mechanic involves, that's actually one of my favorite mechanics. A game like Stone Age, a game I really enjoy playing on, for example, the online site I play on primarily is Yucata, and they offer the game Stone Age, and I love playing it 2 players against another really good player. It's again, this sort of back and forth, really thinky experience that I enjoy. But anyway, Stone Age involves this mechanic. It's one of the most well-known or famous examples of a worker placement game, right? You start off with a pool of, say, is it 5 workers, I think, in Stone Age? And you can grow your family in the game Stone Age. You can get more workers into your pool. But you have these 5 workers, and then one at a time, everybody takes turns with their workers, putting the worker out on a particular area of the board where they then get to do that action. And the idea is once you put your worker there, usually then nobody else can go and do that same action. So you and only you, or you and only a select few others who go there, will be able to perform that action. So worker placement, that's another example of mechanics that you will find in games. And again, that's an example of one of my favorites. Another example of one of my favorite mechanics involved in games, and one that's probably pretty straightforward and easy to understand, is trading. I like games that involve trading of some sort, right, where that will automatically, right, involves interaction with other players. So I like games where there's that element of trading always at play, because it keeps you, one concept in gaming is known as downtime. How long do you have to sit in between your turns, or how long of periods of time are there where you're doing nothing, right? And usually with games with trading, that is minimized, because you're always, or oftentimes at least, able to make trades with players even on their turns. So I like games oftentimes that will employ the mechanic of trading, where you can trade various resources you've acquired during gameplay with other players. So anyway, that's the idea of mechanics and what we mean by the notion of mechanics in these strategy board games. So moving right along in that PowerPoint presentation that I had to do for that program, another concept that is pretty weighty, pretty heavy, that you'll come across sometimes, the more immersed you become in the hobby, is the concept of weight. How heavy is a particular game? So we have on the one end of the spectrum what I would say are the lightest of the light, the ones that play you, where there's literally no thinking at all involved. Games like Shoots and Ladders, or Candyland, where you're drawing a card and then just going to that spot. Right, that is as light as it gets. So what is this idea of weight? It sort of describes, in some sense, how thinky the game is. That's the best way to kind of, as I mentioned, I guess at the top, that's the first thing I mentioned at the top of the PowerPoint slide. And if you were to try to describe it in one general way, it would be, how thinky is the game? And I broke it down at the time in terms of thinking of it in 3 sort of aspects. How complex is the gameplay? Right, there are a lot of different elements involved. And one of the things I've really grown to love over time, and that I shoot for in my own designs, is simple gameplay, right? Not a lot of rules, but then using not a lot of rules, offering very deep gameplay, right? Where using not a lot of rules, the game still allows for a lot of variety in terms of the gameplay itself. That's the sweet spot, right? because I think games can be, I don't like a heavy game where it's overly complex, right? There's too much going on, there's too much involved. But that then backing up a bit, right? Gameplay complexity. How complex is the game, right? How much is going on? How much is involved? That's one of the factors that then determines how heavy the game is. The more that's involved, the more moving pieces and parts, the heavier the game is going to be considered. Right? Then, as I mentioned, the strategy sort of luck element, right? How much do you have control over versus how much is the game playing you? Kind of what we've already been getting into, right? The more players have control, the more that strategy and tactics is involved are involved, the heavier the game is going to be considered, right? The lighter games are going to be the ones where you don't have to think at all, right? Where they're basically entirely luck dependent, where the game again is basically playing you, you're just following along, right? And then the third element I reference in the presentation, in the PowerPoint presentation, is the time investment. And I'd say that probably matters least, at least in my mind, in terms of characterizing these games in terms of their weight, but it does matter, right? Longer games in general are usually implicitly are more complex, right, in the first sense. In general, the longer a game is, the heavier it tends to be referred to, right, or to be characterized as. Okay, so how complex is the gameplay? How strategic is it? How thinky is it? Although that's the general descriptor I've been using, right? And then how long is the gameplay, right? How long does the game take to play itself? Those are all involved in kind of deducing or estimating the weight of a particular strategy board game. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. And so I referenced one really cool strategy board game site. I can't believe I haven't mentioned it yet. I'll be getting into it and referring to it throughout the rest of the episode, I'm sure, is Board Game Geek. And so, I referenced at the very bottom of that slide the scale that users on Board Game Geek use to assess the weights of the various games they play. So one of the things you can do if you're a board game nerd like me is you can establish a profile on this website, Board Game Geek, and then you can, estimate what you think the weight of these various games is, and you use that scale. So, if you Chutes and Ladders or Candyland for me, I would be estimating, I would be rating that a 1 in terms of its heaviness. It's light. Go all the way to the 5. Phil Eklund is one designer. I don't expect, very few people are familiar with him. He's involved in a lot of controversies lately, but anyway, his games tend to be very meaty. They would be towards the very heavy end of the spectrum. Somebody like Uwe Rosenberg, who designed a very popular game back when I was getting into the hobby, known as Agricola. His games can be fairly heavy. Agricola was one that I would say tends to be on the heavier side. So, and a lot of games then fall somewhere in the middle. Most of them probably. And I would say if I had to pick kind of my sweet spot. Again, I don't like super long, drawn-out games. I personally don't mind them, I guess. It's not that I don't like them. It's just, for kids, time is definitely an issue, work and so on. So my sweet spot, given all the factors at play, is really like 2 to 3, right? Medium light to medium. Granted that I'll play basically anything. I love strategy board games. I will play basically anything. Sans Candyland, Chutes and Ladders, and that stuff. I literally don't think I will play those games anymore. Maybe if a kid really, looked at me with a really sad expression, maybe they could coax me into playing. But the point was, in general, I'll play almost anything. But, so, having said that, I prefer that certain weight. I'll still play almost anything. Okay, then I wanted to get into, so talk about weight. I've been alluding to strategy and tactics all along. I think I even might have briefly defined them earlier, but I wanted to get into this distinction in a little bit more detail now. So we have strategy versus tactics. So the general difference, and I would say, again, they're both involved in what makes strategy board games thinky. And you could, I would argue, just as be justified in calling them strategy and tactical board games. Now, granted, I guess the more strategical a game is, the more thinky it's going to be, and that's usually the case with tactics, but I guess maybe not as much. Anyway, so what is the difference? So strategy refers to the long-term planning involved in strategy board games, right? What you have an effect over long-term. So a game that's deep in strategy is going to sort of couple ways you can look at it, I think. The decisions you make, they can have they do have long-term consequences, and therefore you're able to make meaningful decisions not only in the short term in terms of what happens in the game, but long term, right? And that pays off in these games. Doing so, having a mind for and planning for the future, right? And having a strategy in mind pays off in these games that are high in strategy. Another sort of factor at play when it comes to the strategy aspect of these strategy board games would be there's usually like different paths to victory. And so this is one of the points I referenced in the presentation, I think the second bullet point. Right? Oftentimes, games that offer a lot of strategy, there's going to be different ways to win, right? Different paths. So maybe the winner is the person with the most points. A lot of times that's the case, but there's going to be lots of different ways to get points, right? Or sometimes even there'll be different winning conditions, different ways you can win the game. So that then is going to reflect strategy, right? Long term, you have different goals depending on which winning condition you're going for. Okay, so there's these games that are rich in strategy or deep in strategy oftentimes will have different paths to victory or even different winning conditions. Now, tactics, conversely, so think of strategy as being long-term focused. Tactics is more short-term, right? So it's still thinky, but you have to react to changes in the game state immediately. Something's drawn, and so it affects sort of how good your hand is, right? You have to make these tactical adjustments to how the game is playing out. So a game that's rich in tactics has you constantly on your seat, right? Because you have to be appraising everything that's going on and be ready to adjust at all times. So tactics reflects sort of the element of these strategy games where you have to think about and adjust to the ever-changing states of the game as the gameplay progresses. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. So I think that, for the most part, captures strategy versus tactics. I guess maybe one or two more here. Last sort of thing, one or two more things I want to flesh out would be this idea of luck and randomness. Okay, so you get a lot of discussions about the luck involved in these games. And obviously, I already mentioned how the more strategic a game is, oftentimes it's going to involve less luck. But that's not always the case, right? A game that's high in luck, that's not mutually exclusive with a game that's high in strategy. A game could be high in both, but usually I would say, a game that has a lot of luck or randomness involved, right? Where that means you don't have control. The more luck or randomness involved in a game, the less control the players have, right? The more that is the case, the less control they have, right? The less thinky or strategic the game tends to be. Okay, so again, what do we mean by luck or randomness? It's the degree to which a game is out of the player's control. Right? So take a game like chess, which has, so one of the things I want to talk about is perfect information. This idea of perfect information. Chess basically has no luck, right? Perfect information means the players know everything there is to know. Right? In some sense, it's completely deterministic. You could just, based on a certain move, figure out exactly what all the possibilities are, and so on. So a game with perfect information, something like chess, it's going to have no luck, no randomness involved. You could say, I guess, it's not really random, right? But what your opponent does, you don't really know that part. But other than that, within the game itself, there's no element of luck or randomness. Okay? And so on the complete opposite end of the spectrum then is the sorts of games where you have no control, right? You don't know any of the information until you draw the card or spin the spinner, right? And again, that's indicative of a game that has a high luck or randomness value, if you will. Blah blah blah. So what do I prefer? I would say most gamers, right, strategy board game players, they're not going to like a lot of luck or randomness. However, having said that, I don't like typically games with perfect information. Now, granted, one of my favorite games of all time, if not my favorite, the favorite, would be Torres, and that, one of the ways I like to play, there is perfect information. But generally, I don't like perfect information. I do like a little bit of randomness or luck sprinkled in. Otherwise, it becomes too deterministic. That's the word I used earlier, right? It almost doesn't seem like a game anymore. It becomes like an exercise in who is willing to invest the most time sort of seeing where all these possibilities go, right? I don't know if I explained that very well, but for me, it sort of loses some element of the fun factor if you know everything that's going to happen, right? Because then, why am I not here just calculating, right, every possible move in this chess game and so on and so forth. So I like, and I don't know how well that was explained, but I like some element of randomness or chance sprinkled in. And granted, some, right? Not a whole lot. And I prefer, in general, for the luck or randomness in my strategy games, the sweet spot would be very, very low, but some of it. I think that's everything I wanted to say, really, in terms of fleshing out what strategy board games are. So hopefully you have a pretty good idea now. You could even go to a board game convention and know the lingo, right? We've gone through all sorts of different concepts and terms that you'll hear flung about if you do go to a board game convention sometime. So we've, again, established what strategy board games are and gone through a lot of these different related concepts. So in the next part of the episode, I'll get into my own personal history with strategy board games. How was it that I was first introduced to them? And then what has my relationship looked like with them ever since?